how to get promoted by God and people. The Word of God says that promotion cometh not from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south, but God is the judge. He putteth down one and bringeth up another. Psalm 75, 6-7. So promotion comes from the Lord. And we see in the pages of the Bible that people got promoted even from unlikely circumstances. Joseph was brought out of the prison to be the prime minister of Egypt. David was brought from the shepherd's fields, just watching the sheep in the back 40, to be the king of Israel. And promotion is something that will come, but pretty much everybody that ever got promoted has these characteristics in common. Number one, be faithful over that which is another man's. Luke 16:12, Jesus said, "And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own?" See, you first must train your skills and hone your skills to be faithful in that which is another man's. You will never be able to succeed at owning your own business, being pastor of your own church, unless you are a highly valued member of someone else's team. Do you realize that Joseph in the Bible, he was never actually taking care of his own business, his own country, his own prison, his own enterprise? God brought him to the status in which he was because he was always being faithful over that which was another man's. First, he was being faithful over his father's flocks. He was just a young lad, but he was being faithful there over the father's flocks. You know, I started work at a very young age. My dad grew up in an era where young people worked, and I started work by the time I was 6. By the time I was 7, I was a good employee for him, doing the dishes at Honeyberry Farm. I always had money. I didn't know it wasn't that normal for kids not to work. I had money, I had a self-respect, and I've never wanted a job because I have a good work ethic. Joseph was faithful even over his father's flocks at a very young age. There's an excellent movie, a Joseph movie on YouTube for free, and as I watched that movie, they depicted the scene where he's out with his 11 brothers, and his father had actually set him as eyes and ears over the others with the coat of dignity and everything. And the guys were out there and they said, let's just kill one of them prime young sheep and eat it tonight. And Joseph said, no, you can't. Your father gave you victuals here in the pack. And they said, well, who's going to tell him? And they went ahead and slaughtered the young sheep. Joseph was continuing to be a voice of dissent to their enterprise. So that's when they threw him in the pit. If you ever want to be promoted by God, be faithful over that which is another man's. Colossians 3:23-24 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord and not working for just another man, since you know that you will receive a reward and inheritance from the Lord himself. So that verse says that whoever you find yourself working for, work as if you're working for the King of Kings. Work as if you were working for God himself, because it says that you will receive a reward from the Lord. And sometimes that reward is promotion. Joseph was in a prison as a prisoner. It doesn't seem that there would be much incentive to do a good job if you were in a prison, but that's just who he was. And that is, for some, the good truth. For some, maybe not such a shining truth, but wherever you are, there you are. Wherever you find yourself, there you are. And Joseph was just a faithful dude. He was just a guy that was always trying to help whatever enterprise he was involved with shine. He was a guy that was trying to do his best as unto the Lord. So when he found himself in a prison, he began doing the very best that he possibly could, even right there in the prison. Soon his skills were noticed, and the warden set him over the whole prison. And that prison was one of the finely run institutions in Egypt. If anybody wanted to go to a prison, they wanted to go to Joseph's prison because it was clean, it was organized, the food was well cared for, and so were the prisoners. It was being faithful even in that smelly prison that caused God to notice Joseph and promote Joseph from the prison to actually being the prime minister of all of Egypt. So if you want to be promoted by God and people, be faithful over that which is another's. The key verse for my life and for the Faithful Network is found in Matthew chapter 25. It says the king was leaving and he entrusted his talents to 3 guys. He gave one 5 talents, another 3 talents, and another 1 talent. And he said, occupy until I return. The term talent, I think, is significant because we have all been given talents by God. We have all been given something that we can do. And it's a hard gig when you have only 1 talent and you're on the same planet as those who have 5 talents. To be perfectly honest with you, it's been an uphill challenge for me to be faithful with the little bit of musical and singing ability that I have when there's people like Michael Jackson and ZZ Top and Dire Straits and some highly talented people on this earth, and yet they can't be everywhere at once. So I have tried to be faithful with the rather moderate singing and playing gift that I have. And praise God, God has used me in 37 nations of the world. I've even been on television. I was blessed to see that on Spotify I had 7,000 views of one of my songs when I checked last time. And so even a moderately talented person should be faithful with the talent that you have, and then God will give the increase. Now, the talent in that culture was actually a unit of money equivalent to about $1,360. They were also to be faithful with whatever finances God had given them to produce increase for the kingdom of the king. And when the king returned, of course, he checked on them, and those that did well, he said, man, you were good with what I gave you. I'm going to give you more. Promotion. Others had hidden the talent, not used what God had given them, and they were thrown into outer darkness. So point number 1 is be faithful over that which is another man's. Point number 2, shoot to be 5 to 2 minutes early at your job, and be ready when your time to work is come. Every employer will love you if you are the on-time person who is ready for your shift. To do so, you will need to aim at being a little early, because all of us find those last-minute things that we need to take care of. And if we don't aim for being early, we will actually be late. I had a wonderful deacon in one of my churches called Grizzly Al Kaikona. He was a guy that God drew him in during one service. He said, I don't even know why I came. I just felt compelled to come in the door. And he sat there, this big mountain man, and wept for several services in a row and gave his life to Christ. And he became one of our indispensable deacons in that church. Now, Grizzly Al always showed up to church a half hour early. Sometimes he'd show up before I did. So I ended up giving him a key because he'd open things up and get everything looking great before I even arrived. And I asked him once, what's the deal with you always being a half hour early? He said, that's the way I am everywhere I'm involved. If I have a job, I'm a half hour early. If I'm a part of a club or something, I'm a half hour early because I know that then I will be composed, I will look proper, and I will be ready to go. And I thought, wow, that's commendable. Now, I have personally never attained to that old school type of ethic, but I have tried to be early in my jobs because the boss doesn't like it if you get there and then you need to go to the bathroom. The boss doesn't like it if you get there but then you really need to try to eat your food on the side because you haven't eaten and you're not prepared to work for at least 3 hours without some food. So if you want to be promoted, shoot for being 5 to 2 minutes early and be ready when your shift starts. Number 3, if you are ever late, be running late. I had a coach in baseball. I played about 2 decades of baseball or softball. And we had this one coach that told us, guys, if you're ever late to my practice, you had better as heck be running late because I don't take kindly to you being late. And so, boy, if any of us were ever late for practice, we were running at top speed and saying, sorry, coach, what can I do? And that was the attitude that we had. And so, friends, if you ever are late for your work, be running late. Be motating, be coming in at full throttle, apologetically, and ready to go. You know, in the summer here at Huckland, we run really long shifts. We're open from 8 or 8:30 in the morning till 10 at night. And so I work long hours, and usually I exercise before work. So sometime I'm a couple minutes late, and there's actually people waiting. Boy, I pull my truck in and I run back to the back and I run up here and turn on the lights and open the door, and people look at me and say, whoa, you don't have to act like the house is on fire, you know, we're not going anywhere. And I said, well, I'm just taught that if I'm ever late, I'm running late, and I'm sorry for being late. Now, inside their mind, they might think, well, he didn't have to go that fast, but in the back of their mind, they're probably, we're appreciating this guy. Look at his commitment to serve us, even if he's late. So number 3 is, if you are ever late, be running late. Number 4, carry yourself with respect to your supervisors. I learned most of what I am teaching you in the construction trade because for about 2 decades I was a carpenter before I ever opened up Huckleberry Land. I began being a carpenter at age 12 when Dad promoted me from being a dishwasher to being a carpenter. I was a good dishwasher, so he figured he'd give me a chance at being a carpenter. And I really appreciate my father for teaching me those skills. They've been a blessing everywhere I've went in life. And that is also why you will never catch me complaining about the work here at Huckleberry Land, because it is so easy compared to building houses in the rain. Now, after I had been a carpenter for many seasons, I began building houses on my own. I began being the head lead guy, and we were actually building carpenters, and I hired a lot of various guys to help me over the years. Now, I hired this guy from South Carolina that he had actually come to a church that I had on Main Street in Kalispell. He looked like a stalwart lad, so I gave him a job. So I found that whatever task I was doing, building the house, Brian would say, you know, in South Carolina, we snap a line like this. We do this, and we put it out there, and we do this. And I'd say, oh, okay. And then the next thing had come, and he said, you know, when we line up a wall to frame it, this is how we do it there in South Carolina. And everything that I'm doing, he's trying to tell me a better way. And after a while, I really felt like saying, if you're so stinking smart, why were you hitchhiking through Montana and me, I'm the foreman of a house building project? But some people, they are like that. They're smarter than their boss. They carry themselves not with respect to their supervisor, but like their supervisor should really be listening to them because they're 10 times smarter than the supervisor. Some guys I've hired have simply not been hard workers, and they usually find a little phrase like, oh, I'm sorry, we're running out of work. I don't have something for you next week. But this guy actually was a hard worker, so I kept him on and kept humoring him with his attitude that knew better than I did on every aspect of the trade. Now, other guys I hired actually were Cracker Jack carpenters and actually did know more than what I knew about the carpentry trade. But they always carried themselves with a respect to me as the boss because they had been around and they knew that if they were going to excel and keep their job and maybe get a raise, that they needed to do that. But on certain occasions, just every once in a while, they would say something like, now this would go better if we lock this wall in this fashion. That's what we need to do. And I'd say, oh, thanks for bringing that up. That kind of slipped me right then. And so there are people that you will hire or you will work with and even be a superior over that may be smarter in certain aspects. And if you're a foreman of any kind, you can learn from that. As a subpoint under point 4, carry yourself with respect to your superiors. Write down A. Never gossip about your boss behind his or her back. Be loyal. Even non-Christian people believe in something called karma. What goes around comes around. You are going to reap what you sow. So if you have this gossip behind your superior's back idea, you can be assured that if you ever get to be a leader of people or a leader of a company or have something of your own, you will reap what you have sown. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together. You will have multiplied gossipers come on your team, gossiping about you behind your back, because you certainly do reap what you sow. So friends, it's not worth it. Sow the kind of things that you want to reap in your own world, in your own life. King David had such a lasting, powerful dynasty because he incorporated this principle, which is B. Never touch God's anointed. Psalm 115, 15 to 17. Touch not mine anointed, and do my prophets no harm. So the leader of a company, male or female, the leader of a church, male or female, the leader of a household, male or female, never make the mistake of touching God's anointed. I was looking for more information on this subject, so I heard a young guy, a young pastor that had a lot more views than I do, and he was saying, this verse does not mean you can't speak about your pastor or you might be in danger. He said the context of this verse is Israel. Israel was the anointed, chosen people of God, and even people that came to curse, they would bless, and people would get in trouble if they talked ill of Israel, and also of Abraham. He said Abraham was a prophet, and because Abraham was a prophet, even kings that would take his beautiful wife to be their own wife, they would find themselves breaking out with boils. They would find their household being afflicted until they would come to Abraham and say, hey, why didn't you tell me this gal was actually your wife and not only your sister? I could have sinned and brought judgment on my whole household on account of her. So his point was that was for Abraham, that was for Israel. That doesn't apply like to the leader of your company. That doesn't apply like to the pastor of your church. And I commented on YouTube, well, why the heck doesn't it apply? If you were not to touch the anointed prophet in the days of old, why should you touch the anointed prophet in modern times? That's a good point, I thought. But David had such a lasting, loyal dynasty because he reaped what he sowed. Although he was the armor bearer for Saul. Now, let me tell you a little about armor bearer. Armor bearer is the person who walks in front of the main warrior. They're the person that carries the shield to guard the main warrior. They're the person that might have an extra spear latched onto themselves. Their job is to basically be a bodyguard for the main guy. And that's why Saul loved David so much, because he was a really good armor bearer. His whole job was to guard Saul, to go out before him. He eventually got promoted to leading teams and being a leader himself because he had that armor bearer spirit about him. Some people, rather than being an armor bearer, they'll be actually the one shooting the arrows at the boss, shooting the arrows at the pastor. That's not right. That is touching God's anointed. And you can incur judgment on yourself for doing so. I had a guy that was really bad at this one time in Jamaica when I was leading a church project. And he was just, in a very blatant way, trying to undercut and undermine everything I was doing. After a week or two of this, he came into me and this guy actually even pulled a machete on me and was saying he should be the leader and was willing to fight me for the position. But after a little bit of this, he came in and he was blind. He could not see. Now, the natural part of it, maybe he had gotten into something, but he was blind. He couldn't see, and he said, man, I want to repent. I realize that what I've done is not right. Would you pray for me? Would you forgive me? I prayed for the young man, and his sight was restored. So don't touch God's anointed. Well, what about times when the anointed is just so off? What about, for instance, the American Revolution, where a whole country rose up against the king? Well, there are times when people vote with their feet and just move on. That is definitely a subject for careful thought and consideration. Number 5, vent in appropriate ways. Sometimes things build up on you on the inside, and if you don't share, it can become a caustic cancer that does spread to other employees or associates. I had such a situation when I had just been hired by a nice man that I enjoyed working for, but then he put me to work clear down in Flathead Lake, and it was an hour-and-a-half drive each day, and for the same wage, and I realized I was having a problem with it. So in a nice way, I just said, Larry, I enjoy working for you, but that's a lot of drive time. Is there any way you can kind of compensate some of my drive time? And he was able to, and it kept us both at peace. With my employees at Huckland, I try to stress in the beginning induction how important it is to speak to me rather than vent to others if there is a problem. And I know I appreciate that, but it can be an intimidating thing for an employee to speak to their boss, and I realize it is. It will probably end up positive for both parties. Some companies I have worked for, like the Home Depot, they purposely make times for their employees to vent. It's called a town hall. They gather all the employees in a room. They have like an assistant manager hearing the complaints. People vent their frustrations. The person notes it. And a lot of times things aren't even done about it, but just the very act of letting employees vent can alleviate the pressure cooker. Number 6, how will you work when nobody but God is watching. Now, in a lot of stores and retail establishments, there's cameras that those in authority do check on certain occasions. So there may never truly be a time when nobody is watching, but you get the point. There are times when obviously the boss isn't there, when obviously you're not being watched. How will you work then? Is that a time for you to get on your phone and do this or do that? Or is it a time for you to see what you can do to make the company shine even brighter than it is? King David was the youngest of many brothers. He was the one made to shepherd all the sheep out in the back 40. Maybe he was the one winning bread for the family. And when the great prophet came to the house, he wasn't even called in for consideration. But he was out in the back 40 with nobody but God watching. And he was doing his utmost to shepherd that flock with skill and care, killing wolves, killing bears, getting more proficient in the use of his sling, shepherding the flock with skill and care. And when the prophet of God came, the whole world knew that God had been watching when nobody else was. So how about you? How are you doing in your place of employment, in your job, in your ministry, when nobody but God is watching? Number 7, when the boss asks you to do something, say yes or okay or got it or I'm on it. However you like to express yourself, but don't just be silent. When I ask one of my employees to do something and they're silent, it's a waste of time, because a lot of times I'll go back and say, did you catch that? And then they'll say, yeah. A lot of times that is a sign of a deteriorated relationship with that employee. And there's nothing worse than having an employee just be quiet rather than at least say, okay, I'll do that, than having them in their body language or in maybe a secret roll of the eyes or something, do something in their body language that is disrespectful to the employer. I can say for experience that when that happens here, I am actively seeking another employee to replace such an individual. And I have also been on the other end of that, where working for others in construction, I have been the replacement. One time I came to work for Dalkey Construction in Kalispell, and after 4 hours of treating the boss respectfully and doing my best on the job, the boss came up to me and said, Jim, I need you to really watch what the other guy is doing. I need you to figure out how to do it by watching him. And the next day, the other guy was gone. It was probably a situation like I had described, where the boss, at his earliest convenience, was finding a replacement for such an employee. The greatest gift that you can probably give to your employer is a good attitude. Attitude is contagious. If the attitude of the employees toward the boss is positive, it will spread. If there comes a bad apple that starts having a negative attitude toward the boss, you can be sure that that will spread also. Number 8, timing is key to ask for a raise. Many companies don't want to give raises unless they have to. So sometimes you gotta ask, but you gotta do something called read the room before you ask. In other words, you got to look at indicators to make sure that the company is doing all right. You got to also make sure it's not toward the end of a seasonal place of employment. You also need to make sure you haven't gotten reprimanded regularly in the last 2 or 3 weeks. But if you've read the room and things look appropriate, it's not wrong to say, hey, I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job for you. Is there any way to get a little raise? Number 9, loyalty. Especially loyalty when others in the company are gunning for the boss can be really rewarded. In Esther chapter 6, that night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. He said, "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" You see, the king couldn't sleep. Promotion doesn't come from the east or the west, but from the Lord. So God made it so the king couldn't sleep until the good, honest, loyal guy was rewarded. There may be times in your company where there is an Indian uprising and they are gunning for the manager, but you are loyal and say, "No, I don't want to participate in this gossip." And maybe you even at the right time report it to the boss. Well, loyalty is rewarded. I was with Home Depot for a while, and most every company does things and should do things to instill loyalty. Their phrase was, "We want you to bleed orange." In other words, down to the core of your being, we want you to be a Home Depot man or woman. Well, I myself was their fastest cashier for about 3 or 4 weeks in a row. And when I was out in the lawn and garden, sometimes when somebody was shopping and had a big cart, rather than just saying, "I need to close down," I'd wait that extra 5 minutes to make them an extra $600 or $700. And yet they were still paying me only $8.75 per hour. And I knew I was making them a lot of money. So my bleed orange got kind of thin when they weren't sharing with me commensurate to what when they were not sharing with me commensurate to what I was making for them. Number 9, focus on faithfully refining your skills rather than money, and money will come. The Bible verse for that is, "A faithful man or woman will abound with blessing, but one eager to be rich will not go unpunished." Proverbs 28:20. This became an unforgettable life lesson for me in Alaska. I had already worked at least 6 years of carpentry for my father. I had built condos in Denver. I felt like I had it going on. So I went up to Anchorage and I got a good job for $12 an hour in 1986. I worked hard, as I always do, but after a week the boss came to me and said, "Jim, I can see that you're a hard-working guy, but you just don't have the skills refined to a point that you can really do this high-level home building. But if you'll take $10 an hour, I'll teach you the skills of what you need to know to actually do what I do, even to build these fine homes." Well, I felt insulted and felt that I was worth $12 an hour, so I quickly night shopped around for another job. Great lesson, Tarzan's first rule of the jungle. Don't let go of the one vine until the other vine is firmly in your grasp. So I went and did that, working on multi-million-dollar homes, but after a few weeks I got fired. The only time in my life I've ever been fired. Part of it may have been kind of a funny story. The boss asked me to follow him across town to another job site. I put in a Christian cassette in my Corolla and was following him thinking, "Man, this is great. I'm just driving around listening to music, making $12 an hour." And I had gotten complacent and I wasn't being diligent to follow the van, and I started following the wrong van. And this van started taking lefts and right and going through crazy little motions. And finally, a person I didn't recognize jumped out of the van and said, "What are you following me for?" It was humiliating to me that I had to call the boss and tell the boss that I had not followed him correctly. Where was he at? That was before the days of Siri. Anyway, I went before God and I said, "God, here I am, a young man, working my heart out, trying my hardest, and now I get fired. What am I supposed to do?" And as I was seeking God, I read this verse, "A faithful man will abound with blessing, but one eager to be rich will not go unpunished." And I thought, man, I've really been putting the dollar per hour thing above being faithful and learning a skill, I think I'm just going to go into the next job with the mindset to really learn a skill and improve what I can bring to the table. So I contacted Denali Woodworking and I said, I'm a guy that just really wants to learn to know what you guys do. I know that you're one of the best in the city, and if you'll teach me how to do it, I'll work for only $8 an hour. Well, they rolled out the red carpet for me and said, come on in. And I became the low man on the totem pole who did all the sanding in really fine, extravagant woodwork. But as I was sanding and being faithful in my post, they were faithful to teach me the ins and outs of custom woodworking. It was pretty cool because we were even working for the governor of Alaska, also for Mr. Hunt of the Hunt Corporation, and my skills went from here to here. My wage never did, although I did get quite a bit of overtime at $12 an hour. After a year and a half, their company was going through some restructuring, and they said to me, Jim, you have been the best employee that we have ever had as a company, but we are doing some changes and going a different way and can't really keep you employed. So my very next job, I was able to take the skills I had learned and do them for a CEO in Santa Cruz, California, who paid me $15 an hour plus room and board in a really cool Victorian house in Santa Cruz, California. So although the company I was learning from never gave me a raise, God saw my skills development and He gave me a promotion. So these are the 10 keys, friends, and I believe that if you follow these, you will be promoted in the eyes of God and man. God bless you.